Hello everyone, this is Paul the Oaken Knight coming back to you to continue our discussion on what I'm doing to create my game table. And if you recall, I am building a table topper for my existing game table, which is a former conference room table. You can look at my prior videos to get more details on my starting point for the project. But for today, what I want to do is talk about the materials that I'm using in the build and the process I went through to select the various pieces, parts that I need to buy to build this table. The table is going to require the following components. First, there's a plywood base. So this is going to be the part that's in physical contact with the existing table and is going to form the backbone of the new table. Second, I am going to be using hardwood for the main components of the table aside from the plywood base. And so I'm going to review how I went about selecting the hardwood that I chose and what options were there to choose from. And finally, it was a bit of an adventure, but figuring out what to do with the bottom of the well. So again, this is going to be a two-level table, but even if it's a one-level table, you still have to figure out what you're going to do to cover up that plywood if you choose to cover it up. You don't have to. But if you want something that, say, for aesthetic reasons looks nicer, well, then you're going to have to think through what you're going to do to cover the bottom of the well of the table. All right, so let's talk about plywood. Now, I saw four main options for the plywoods that I would use. Now remember, because my table base is 8 foot by 4 foot, even though it has those funky curves at the ends, whatever I select is going to have to end up being larger than 8 foot by 4 foot, which is kind of an inconvenient thing as far as, cost efficiency goes. But it is what it is, and so I have to deal with it. The first option would be Baltic birch. Baltic birch is a premium product coming from Russia. So right now its availability is scarce and its price is high. But for certain applications, it's really nice because it has probably twice the number of plies that a standard plywood would have. It has no gaps at all in between the plies. And perhaps best of all, it has thicker than normal nice outside layer. So it's actually thick enough to be useful as opposed to regular plywood where it's just a very, very thin coat on the outside. That's the quote nice part that you see. Baltic birch, it has some substance to what is on the outside of the plywood, and you can use that to your advantage. If you can find it and if you're willing to pay. The source I found had it probably at about $130 a sheet or so. And since, by my calculation, to do what I need to do, I'm going to need 3 sheets because I have to cover something larger than 8 by 4. So that was a bit much. Second choice, hardwood veneered plywood. Now you can find this. It's at the nicer lumber yards. It's at Woodcraft. And it's a little bit on the expensive side also, but if you wanted to have cherry veneered plywood or walnut veneered or whatever species you want, you may be able to find it, especially domestic stuff. And you could actually buy it pre-veneered. Now, the issue with that is that that veneer is probably no thicker than standard plywood, so it's probably best used in the vertical. So like if you're making a cabinet and you want a nice side on the cabinet, but the cabinet side itself is not going to take much abuse, that would be a good application for it. For a tabletop, which kind of by definition is always going to be abused, especially a game table, it could be a suboptimal choice. Third, sanded plywood. Sanded plywood, you can find it at Lowe's, you can find it at Home Depot, and it is basically has a nice finish on the exterior of the plywood. It's standard plywood, but it doesn't have all the knots and things, or at least if they have some, it's been filled. They usually come with a B/C rating, so one side is B quality and the other side is C quality, but both sides are generally pretty good for most things that you're going to do. And finally, just regular construction plywood that you would use in a home. And there you're going to have knots and things and splinters possibly, but it still will be, 3/4 inch plywood or whatever it is you choose you want. Now, for me, I said the Baltic birch I didn't think it was cost effective for me to go Baltic birch. I was able to find it, but something close to $400 would be a bit much. And I basically, in my application, since I am going to cover it with something, it's never going to be seen. So all of the nice things about Baltic birch are really not being taken advantage of. So it didn't take long for me to knock that one off the list. Hardware veneered, basically too fragile for a table, as I mentioned. Yes, it may look nice for a while, but with the beating that a tabletop generally is going to take, I just don't think it's appropriate. Finally, construction plywood. I don't want to deal with splinters and stuff. So I went with the standard plywood from Home Depot. As long as it's flat and true, and you got to be careful because sometimes the guys at Home Depot and Lowe's, they find creative ways to store this stuff. They don't adjust the rack properly so that it lies flat. And when they do that, it's useless. It gets all bent up and you just walk past it and find another store. But I did find very nice sanded plywood at Home Depot, and that's what I'm basing my project on. I had to buy 3 sheets. Then the thickness of the plywood for my application, because I'm extending out beyond the table, especially with the curved corners, that's not going to have any support underneath, I decided to go with 3/4 inch, and I think that was a good choice for me. And as I said, because of the dimensions of my table being larger than 8x4, I got to do some woodworking magic that's going to require 3 sheets of plywood to fit over this surface, with a little bit extra for me to use to do my other woodworking magic with. Hardwood selection. Well, before I dive into this too far, I'd like to point out that there is a really nice application in the Apple App Store called I.D. space wood, ID wood. If you want to learn about hardwoods and you have an Apple device, I'd recommend going ahead and downloading that. So you can go and have fun looking at all kinds of different domestic and imported hardwood, or they call it exotic hardwood, it's just imported hardwood, to get more knowledgeable and help you make some choices should you decide this is something you want to do. All right, so how did I pick my hardwood? Well, first you have look at the characteristics of the species that you are considering. Is it durable? How much abuse can it take? Some are harder than others. If you get ID wood, there's a thing on there called the Janka scale, Janka, and basically the larger the number, the harder the wood is. If you've never picked up a piece of real hardwood before, you're going to be amazed at how dense it is compared to what you're used to. It's going to be heavier, it's going to be harder, as you might expect, and so it'll be a little, kind of an eye-opening experience first time you pick up a piece of real hardwood if you've never done that before. How available is it? Different species are either easy or hard to find, and it could vary by your area. So if you're in an area of the country where certain species of domestic wood are plentiful, well, odds are your local lumber yards are going to have this. On the other hand, if you're in an area of the country where it's a certain species is hard to find, you're going to have less of it and you're going to pay more for it if you really want it. Likewise with imported hardwoods, their availability can vary a lot, their pricing can vary a lot just due to supply and demand, but also how plentiful the species is in nature. And sometimes there are import restrictions. Some countries that used to export certain types of wood may not be doing it anymore, which brings more scarcity into it and making it harder to find, and it's more expensive if you do find it. Color. I mean, different hardwoods have different colors to them, and not everything is kind of looking like a 2x4. If you want a red piece of wood, guess what? There are species out there that are red. Red heart comes to mind. There's other that are like a deep chocolate brown. There's others that are very light. So take a look at that ID wood, and you're going to be amazed at what you see as far as what different species can look like for color and grain patterns. Grain patterns is another big one. Take a look at zebra wood once, and that's kind of a light and dark stripes all the way up down the board. It's a kind of an interesting effect. And then what is your experience? What projects have you done in the past, and what kind of success did you have doing them with the species you selected? Now, for me, my main experience with hardwoods is, well, shop furniture, and I just use poplar for that. Poplar is probably the cheapest hardwood, but for shop furniture, it's just fine. Sapele and walnut in my old house. When I did my countertops, I did all of the countertops in my home with those woods. And so, partly based on that, I've gone ahead and selected sapele as my primary wood in the table because it is highly available, which means that it is available at a reasonable price of about $9 a board foot for good quality wood. I had no problem locating a source locally for that. The wood has a beautiful ribbon stripe grain pattern. When you see it from an angle, it'll have like light and dark stripes as far as the grain pattern goes. And as you walk past it, the light turns dark and the dark turns light. And it's almost like a kind of a shimmering effect. So I think it's very nice. And so I went with sapele for my primary wood of choice for my table. But I wanted to have a secondary wood, partly because I couldn't find a good sapele match for the well, but I found a walnut that I liked. Okay, I'll get into that in a second. So I just selected walnut as kind of a secondary wood to mix into the table. You'll see how I go about doing that as we go forward. So American walnut, very available. It's a domestic wood, beautiful wood, dark, especially when you put some finish on it. And it's about $12 per board foot for high quality boards that are, say, furniture quality. Now, just a quick note on what is a board foot in case you've never dealt with that. Hardwoods are priced when you go to the lumber yard in terms of board feet. Okay, you're not dealing with dimension lumber here. You're not dealing with a 2 by 4 by 8 foot piece of lumber. You're dealing with boards that are going to be semi-random in length. They could be rough, which means they're kind of fuzzy. They are not nicely milled. They can be twisted. They can be slightly bowed, depending on how good the piece of wood is. A board foot is a measure of volume. If you had a board that was 1 foot by 1 foot by 1 inch, that is the definition of a board foot. That will sweep out a volume of 144 cubic inches, 12 times 12 times 1. And so when I say, oh, well, sapele is $9 per board foot, now you can kind of figure, okay, so if I had a board that was 3 inches wide, 1 inch deep, and 4 feet long, that's a board foot. That would be $9. Okay, that's how we do that. The table well was an interesting thought exercise. The first option for the well would be just leave it alone, leave it as it is, as bare plywood, or maybe with some finish on it, Baltic birch, or just whatever plywood you buy. Second option would be to laminate some countertop material on top. Now, in my case, that wasn't practical because my tabletop is greater than 8 foot by 4 foot, and without seams, unless you're going to accept seams in what you're doing, I don't like that idea for finished countertop material. Unless you accept that, then that was not an option for me, but it could be an option for you. The next option would be flooring, and this is kind of an option that I ended up going with, buying a flooring product. Now, why would I want to buy a flooring product for the top of a gaming table? Well, first off, flooring products are designed to be durable. We're talking about a game table here. This is going to have, rabid gamers around it potentially, doing what rabid gamers do, not paying particular attention to what they're doing. And I want the tabletop to be able to stand up to some abuse. And flooring products are intended to hold up to ladies' high heels, children, things being dropped on them, dogs with their doggy claws digging in. It's designed to handle all that. I think it can handle what a gamer is going to throw at it on the tabletop. Second, you can find products that are waterproof. Yes, we're going to try to keep drinks off the table, but if something should happen, I don't want to have a heart attack trying to get the moisture off the tabletop before it does real damage. Most of the flooring products are going to be waterproof. And the products that I looked at were mostly from Lowe's. I sided with Lowe's instead of Home Depot on looking at my samples is because they had samples at Lowe's and they didn't have samples at Home Depot, so Lowe's got my business on this one. Some of the things I looked at with the sample is how they hooked up to one another. Did they hook up easily or was it a problem? How thick those samples were. Remember, I am paying attention to being conservative in how I manage the vertical part of my table as well. I got to be careful not to get the table too high, and so I'm counting everything. So if I can get a surface that's, say, under a 1/4 inch thick instead of a 1/2 inch thick, that's points in favor of the thinner product. And I want it to look like wood. I want it to look like something that is doing a good job mimicking wood. And the product I selected, I think it's a house brand for Lowe's. It's called SmartCore Naturals. SmartCore Naturals. It's engineered hardwood. It's waterproof. It's 0.19 inches thick. It was the thinnest of all of the products I looked at, except for the real junky stuff. This is kind of a mid-grade product, a little over $4 a square foot. It also looks the most like wood of any of the products. It doesn't have any artificial textures on it like many of them do. And it came in a species that I liked. It comes in walnut. So I said that's going to be my secondary species that I'm using. And so the base of the table is going to be done in a product that's mimicking walnut, but it's going to be an engineered hardwood that can stand up to abuse. Okay, so that was my choice. And finally, I want to give you some sage advice on your first trip to a hardwood lumber store. Now, going to a hardwood lumber yard is not like going to Home Depot. In Home Depot, they have everything nicely arranged in all their racks and so forth, and they have racks at the lumber yard as well. But everything that you see at Home Depot is fully dimensioned lumber. That means, in theory, the opposing sides are flat and coplanar with each other. That means that if you extended them out to infinity, they would never intersect. So if you have say a 2x4, the two sides are actually 3.5 inches wide. If they were properly milled, they would be a flat board, and the two sides they would be coplanar so that they never would intersect if you extended it out to infinity. This is referred to as S2S when it's two sides of the board. If it's all four sides of the boards are milled to the standard, it's going to be called an S4S board. Home Depot boards are in theory S4S, but not really. We all know that some of them look more like McDonald's French fries than anything resembling a board that is S4S. And to say, as far as the length goes, it's more of a random walk going through a hardwood lumber yard. The boards are not really arranged by height. There might be some sorting, but they're really going to be oddball lengths. So you might find one that's 8 foot 4 inches, another one right next to it is 9 foot 2 inches, another one is 7 foot 3 inches. It's going to be like that. And they're all going to be leaning up, usually vertically. You're going to have to go through them, and these boards sometimes can be heavy. So you have to be prepared for that. Having a friend go with you is not a bad idea because some of the boards can get large and some of them can get heavy. What I would recommend is that before you go to the lumber yard, go ahead and go to their website. They probably have one, and download their price sheet. Now, the store I went to is called Peach State Lumber Products, Inc., and it's in Kennesaw, Georgia. And I found it to be probably the best overall lumber store that I've ever seen. Peach State had both domestics and exotics imports, and I wanted to take a look at the imported lumber as well. Now, their sheets, they're probably going to be organized by general categories of wood. So, for example, hardwoods will be in one section. Exotics may be a different section of their handout. Softwoods could be another. Plywoods could be another. And so down the left-hand side, there's going to be a description of what the species is. So it might be red oak, it might be poplar or ash. And you might see something like FAS in front of it, or number 1C. So let's say you have number 1C aromatic cedar. Well, that means like number 1 common board. Okay, number 2 would be number 2 common board. Those are not necessarily cabinet grade pieces of lumber, but depending on your application, it may be just fine. If it says something like FAS, so it could be FAS cherry. FAS stands for first and second. That is probably a cabinet grade board. First means first quality, second means second quality, and it really has to do with how many knots are in the wood. So they're allowed to have so many knots so close together to call it first or second. And the theory is that you generally don't need both sides of the board looking equally good. So having something that can be, quote, second quality, it's actually going to be better than number 1 common. Okay, second, it's not a bad board by any stretch. Going across, there's going to be a table. It's going to form a matrix. So let's say you're looking at FAS poplar, okay? And the columns are going to be organized by the thickness of the board, which is going to be expressed in quarters of an inch. So 4/4 means 4/4 board. 1 inch, 5/4, inch and a quarter, and so on. You can even get a 16/4, be 4 inch thick. That would be a nice bulky board, a very manly board. And then in the matrix that forms is going to be the price per board foot. And generally speaking, the thicker the board, the higher the cost per board foot is going to be. So do download the price sheet and review it, because you need to have a game plan before you go into the lumber yard. You need to know how much of each thickness of lumber you need and what are your length requirements going to be. The more you understand your project, the better job you're going to do at the lumber yard. Go ahead and price it out and see if that's within your budget. I told you the price is per board foot. You take the volume of the board that you are buying and you divide it by 144, and that will tell you the board feet. Then you can multiply by the price per board foot on the chart that the lumber store is going to have. And then I would suggest adding something like 20% to it. And the reason for that is you might need, say, a board that's 4 inches wide, but you're not going to find a board that's 4 inches wide. You're going to find a board that's maybe 5 inches wide. And then that board is going to need to be milled down to a 4-inch wide board that's S2S. Those two sides have to be flat and parallel. Okay. Likewise, the thickness, if you say you need a board you need a 1-inch board, well, you're not going to buy a 4-4 board. You're going to probably buy a 5-foot board if the boards are straight. If the boards are bowed, you might have to go to an even thicker board, because somewhere in that 1.5-inch board, there is a 1-inch board just yearning to come out, and your job is to make it happen. Or if you don't do your own milling, and that's perfectly fine, there are lumber yards that will do it for you for a fee, and I don't think it's that bad. It's not outrageous. Some do, some don't. So before you go, you should give them a call. If you're not going to do your own milling, find out if they do it and what they charge for it. And so you may need to select your lumber store based on whether they will do the milling for you to get the boards to S4S status so that you can go ahead and start using them on your project. If you do that, though, I would suggest that you be sure that the temperature and humidity that the store is operating at is something close to what you have. So I certainly wouldn't mail order boards that somebody else was milling, because say if they're up in Oregon and you're in Arizona, they're operating at 100% humidity all the time, and you're operating at 10% humidity all the time. Those boards, even they may start at S4S, but just as they do at Home Depot, they can start turning into McDonald's French fries on you, and that's not a good thing. So, but if the store is basically operating at something like your temperature and humidity, which means it's fairly local, you probably can go ahead and use those boards right away. If you can let them rest a little bit, a week or two, that might be a good idea. But if you can't mill them, I would say I would use them as soon as I could, just so that they are glued up, they are in your project, and nature, if it decides to go ahead and do something with the board, it's going to at least have to fight against what you glued it into to resist that wood movement. If you mill it yourself, then it's less of an issue. You just bring the boards home. I let the boards for this project sit for about 6 weeks in the environment that the table was going to be in, so they were in my basement. And then when I milled them, I actually left a little bit extra. And the reason why I left a little bit extra was that when you mill, you may release some inner tension inside of the board, and that can result in wood movement. And so I left that little reserve that I could take off the board if I needed to. And then when I actually use the board, then I can take off that little bit of extra and go for it and use the board. All right. At the store, first, if you've never been to one of these places, be prepared to be overwhelmed. When I walked into Peach State Lumber, it's a single building, and it's like a football field. I mean, with the end zones. It is humongous. So you walk in there and you see all this lumber every which way. You see a lot of activity going on, customers, people helping them. They got forklifts running around. I mean, it was something. But over to the side, I saw the racks. Okay, the vertical racks, and then I walked over there and I could see, okay, these are the exotic boards, these are the imported boards. And so I went and I looked around and I found some really nice boards. But this project, I'm going with Sapele, and so that's what I focused on at the lumber store. Now, I was able to find some boards in the racks, but I didn't find everything that I wanted. And so I was wondering, oh, gee, is this all they got? Is this going to be a problem? Do I have to go to another lumber store? So next thing I would say is, after you're suitably overwhelmed when you walk in, and you finally locate the racks, and you pull some boards out, and maybe you find a couple that you like, and you put them on a cart, but you don't find everything. Ask questions. There are people there to help you. So I found a very nice guy who was exceedingly helpful. And during the course of discussion with him, I was telling him what I was after, and he was really interested that I was doing a game table. And I mentioned I needed boards that had certain dimensional characteristics, right? They had to be so big, so thick. So he says, "Oh, okay, no problem." So next thing I know, he has this guy disappear into the back of this immense building with a forklift, and he comes out with a brand new pallet with the strap still in place of the 5/4 sapele that I wanted, 14-foot long boards, 14 feet. Well, I had mentioned that for a certain application, I was looking for 7-foot long boards. So it's like the 14-foot boards were perfect. As part of their service, they just cut them in half for me. Okay. And the boards were outstanding. And then I mentioned that, well, I need 8/4 boards also. And he said, oh, no problem. So the guy goes back again, brings out another brand new pallet of 14-foot boards. It was outstanding. It was totally unexpected that they would have that kind of quantity and that kind of quality. And so I spent about 3 hours at the lumber store going through all this stuff. It was fun. It was not boring, but it was exciting and cool. I had my stepson with me, and we spent all this time picking out boards and moving the boards around, going through the stacks in the pallets, going through the vertical bins to find the best boards that met my requirements or could be cut there by the store so that they would get to my requirement. Also, be prepared to think on your feet, okay? This is where knowing what you need is really important. So, for example, when I went into the store, I noticed that all the boards had been semi-milled already. The large flat surfaces, not necessarily the skinny surfaces on the sides, but the flat surfaces, the large flat surfaces, were fairly flat. I wouldn't call it S2S, but it was pretty close. But that meant that they had run it through a milling machine, okay, which reduces the thickness. So what started as, say, a 4/4 board, 1 inch, was actually about 5/32 thinner than that. And so for certain things, especially if it's starting at 4/4, it's a fairly thin board to begin with, and you're going to lose that 5/32. If you want a 3/4 inch board, you've got 3/32 of an inch to work with, which was exactly what I needed to stay within. I wanted to be a 3/4 inch board. And that was a little bit of surprise. I didn't spot that till I got home, so I had to do some creative thinking to figure out what I was going to do with that, and I ended up thinking my way through it. But at the lumberyard, you got to be prepared to think on your feet. So an example would be, I knew that I was going to put frames around plywood to form the second level of the table. I knew what I would be using, 3/4 inch plywood. So I had to be sure that the final thickness of the board could be 3/4 of an inch thick, or 23/32 of an inch thick. And so I wasn't comfortable with 4/4 wood because the way they had milled it. So I went to 5/4. I made the decision on the spot to get 5/4 wood. I'd gone in thinking 4/4. I walked out buying 5/4 wood. It's good to have that extra 25% in your upfront estimate as far as what it would cost. Because of course that adds to the cost, but I was very happy I did. I got some fantastic wood that's just a little thicker than what I expected to buy, and that's okay. Total cost for the materials for this project for me, for what I've purchased so far anyway, is right around $950. And really about the only thing left that I need to buy is I think I'm going to use laminate for the second level panels so that, they're going to have a hardwood frame. It's going to have a plywood center, and I think I'm just going to get some laminate to put on the top of that. Plywood is going to be about 18, 19 inches wide and the full 4 foot long. And I should be able to laminate that pretty easily, I think. All right, I think that's enough for today. Next time, I'm going to talk about options that may be available to you as someone who probably isn't a woodworker, probably doesn't have all the choices of tools that I have to work with. And I think there are things that you could do to build a game table that you would be satisfied with, that you would like, that won't require all of the stuff that I'm doing. So I want to explore that with you in my next video, because we talked about design so far, we've talked about materials. I think we can bring those two things together, and I'll tell you what ideas I have. Okay, so that's it for today. If you have not subscribed, I'd appreciate it if you would, and you can hit the notification bell and give me a thumbs up and all that good stuff. I would appreciate that very much. And if you have subscribed, well, and I simply say thank you. But for now, I think that's about it, and I simply wish you all a pleasant evening. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.